technologies in design. And this evening I'm super happy to welcome Alex Schweder, who's joining us from New York, through Berlin, but from New York. And Alex is an architect, artist, designer, who, as you will see, does work that has been fascinating me for years and years. And I'm super happy that you'll be showing some of this work this evening. Alex also, and this is the other part of his kind of career and his work, is also an educator who's been teaching for many years at the Pratt Institute in New York, in architecture as well as interior as well as in design. So kind of like a kind of crossover person, like we like him. We have obviously kind of a special connection with Pratt through the faculty throughout the years, which was initially built up by the new president, Peter Benz, and also by Wolfgang Sattler, my predecessor, and so we're really happy that we're kind of blowing new life into this kind of collaboration, this special relationship between Pratt and the Bauhaus-Universität, also through Alex Opie as a kind of contact professor on the other side of the Atlantic. Yeah. So without further ado, Alex, I'm going to leave the stage to you, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm going to apologize in advance for the fact that my spoken German does not live up to my last name. So we'll work our way through that. And I thank you for your patience and your understanding, because we would basically be going over this evening's menu and the weather if I were to use my German. So thank you. I'm particularly excited to be speaking at the Bauhaus today. In many ways, this institution's beginnings were very, very validating to my own research. I studied architecture, practiced architecture, I practiced design, but I became a performance artist as a kind of sideways trajectory of career. And there was something that it was not necessarily, there was always this question about, like, okay, are you an artist? Are you an architect? What is the difference? And what I found through performance, and this term performance architecture, what it's not really about, is this or is this that, or it's more about how do you work? What is your methodology? How do you discover new things? And I found performance to be very informative, because there's this kind of knowledge that's in your body that performance is has developed some really sophisticated ways of accessing. And I think this is particularly important for design, for architecture, where we can begin to evaluate the objects that we make and the spaces that we make through the relationships that they produce or they enable or they open up. Of course, I'm a big fan of form, not as an end. I think it's really important as a way into something. It's almost like you become seduced by the image of a thing, but then once you start using it and engaging it, other things that you had no idea about open up. I was talking to Thomas before my talk, expressing an insecurity about coming to Bauhaus and saying to you, telling people who you are, which you all know very well, of course. But these two diagrams were something that, when I was at the very beginning of the formulation of performance, how does performance and architecture come together? These two diagrams were really validating, and also Yeah, of course we have the Paul Klee diagram from 1922 of the early relationships of pedagogy and teaching here at the Bauhaus, and then placing the stage and building at the center of this relationship, and then it gets taken out 1 year later. Nevertheless, it's still, of course, in the center of practice, this idea of practice. I share these two images because this is how I began thinking about performance. Of course, here we have Oskar Schlemmer and Moholy-Nagy and the designs for really thinking about performance as theater. And my work has kind of gone beyond theater, and it started to work with performance art, which is a very different thing than theater. Performance art, of course, can happen anywhere. And so Rosalie Goldberg is a historian and a curator who formulated the term performance art originally, and she wrote a book called Performance Art from the Futurist to the Present, and of course she talked a lot about performance at the Bauhaus in the beginning chapters of her book. So performance becomes not necessarily something that you watch, not something that that is predetermined and scored, but something that's also improvised, something that is the audience begins to make the meaning of the thing rather than the meaning being delivered to the audience by the work. Another understanding of performance, and I'm just talking about my own personal research into performance in architecture, comes through Judith Butler. There are many ways into this idea of performance in architecture, but Judith Butler uses the term performative subject formation. And she argues that subjectivity, who we are, how we think of ourselves, our identities, form by doing that thing over and over and over again. That it starts to feel like something that's real. And she specifically focuses on gender. And she talks about, she argues against the idea that gender is specific to material or biology. And she says it's constructed through the repeated actions that you're sort of expected to perform. So the way I start to think about, through these two authors and thinkers, the way I start to think about performance and architecture falls into three categories, three areas of research for me. They all have to do with this idea that our buildings are making who we are in some way. Even if we go back to Judith Butler, you think about the men's room and the women's room, and each time you walk through that door, you're constructing yourself in some way, according to someone's idea of gender. My work works more broadly with subjectivity, not necessarily limited to gender, but more along the lines of what would happen, what happens when we change the building but leave the script the same. And by that I mean what you do in this building. This is a house for 6 people that we lived in for 3 weeks. It's 2 feet wide, or 60 centimeters wide by about I'd say 40 feet, so I'm having to do some quick conversions, 13 meters tall by maybe 8 meters wide. And I went into this project, I worked with an artist named Ward Shelley, and we've continued to work together for the last 20 years almost. We made this work called Flatland, moved in, and I thought that what I was excited about was the possibility that this building would change. I imagined it to be almost like a shoe. And the shoe is too tight, so you would begin to kind of like, your toe would push it out and it would start to bulge. But what we found happened, and what we discovered, was that it pushed back on us. That this space started to actually form the relationships that were occurring within it. And after maybe 10 days of living here with a group of 6 artists, half of the group left. They were like, no, this is terrible. This is terrible. It kind of broke down along the lines of people who had brought a lot of stuff in and work well with a lot of things versus people who kind of maybe didn't bring so much stuff in. And one of the things that we found was that because it's only 2 feet wide, you can't really look at a bunch of people like this. You could only have a conversation with one other person. So there was no way of resolving differences or anything like that. The problem was that we were the only ones that knew about about this most interesting fact that we found. The way that it started to shape the relationship. So Ward and I began a number of projects just on our own. This one is called Counterweight Roommate, where we tried to make the relationship that we were exploring between 2 people explicit from the moment you walked in. So there I am in the red, and there's a rope that's tied around my waist and goes up over the building and ties to my partner's waist. And we need to use each other as counterweights all day long to go from room to room. That's the only vertical circulation. So we lived in this one. This one is in Basel, in Switzerland. At the bottom is the bathroom. The top is the kitchen. And then there's a sleeping and workspace, a sleeping and workspace, and then a social living room in the middle. So we spent these 5 days just going up and down, and part of our process is to live our lives as normally as we can, and to not have this kind of theatrical affect where we don't talk to people. You know, if I'm waiting for Ward to be done in the kitchen and I don't want to just stay in the bathroom, I'll be downstairs and talking to people, answering questions. And so there's a dialogue that we have with our audiences that I think is, it's part of a way of understanding what this work means, is hearing from those who are coming to see our work, how they see us, you know, so it's not just us sort of delivering what we think about the world, having that be more of a dialogue with the people that we are lucky enough to have come visit us. We're looking to do a 7-story version of this. I can wait for that to happen because I'm really afraid of heights. So I'm not rushing to do this one, but it will be engaging. So the idea of cooperation was what we were working with in Counterweight Roommate. But I mentioned my fear of heights as a somewhat point of humor. But it actually became a real thing for Ward and I. He needed to take care of this fear of heights because I was really terrified. I would get up to the kitchen and then my knuckles would be white eating a carrot, and that's all I could do. And then I would have to come down. So I lost some weight. That was good. But this idea of caretaking, this idea of being responsible for one another, this sense of mutual responsibility led to the next work. And I talk about these works as sort of embedded in one another because we don't know what we're going to get. You know, we have an idea of what is going to be the relationship that we explore, that we feel, but then there's always something that's different about it. The building is always sort of having this influence on what we actually experience. So this one, we tried to visualize that idea of caretaking. And this is kind of a 2-bedroom apartment in a sense. So there's one apartment on the outside of the wheel. Here's a desk, and that desk is in the same position on the inside of the wheel. Here's the bed on the inside of the wheel, and it's going to be 180 degrees on the outside of the wheel. So and then we have I think this is the bathroom. or no, that's the kitchen up here, and then there's the bathroom at the bottom, and they are hung on gimbals, which is a kind of like a Ferris wheel joint, so that you don't flip out the water, which would be kind of the very wet end to the performance. Here's some more shots going through. There's a video that I think is going to be I won't play the whole thing, but just to give a sense of how these move. We're often asked if there is a if there's a physical feeling that's changed after we leave these works. Do you have sea legs? Do you have a sort of sense of disorientation? And it's not so much physical, but it is relational. You know, the disorientation I felt when we left this work was we were able to feel each other's movements for 10 days while living on this project. And you could almost feel the other person's mood. You can feel them shifting. You know, when you really got a sense of the other person's being, in a sense. You were not necessarily talking or anything, but you always knew that they were there. And there was sort of stepping out into New York City, where this work was installed after these 10 days. There was a real sadness about why aren't people understanding that I'm needing them to get out of my way? They have no idea that I'm here. There's a real distance between me and them after this intimacy for 10 days. So that was, you know, it was again a surprising quality of this work. So I'll continue going on. The idea of intimacy, the idea of how do we connect, how do we communicate, the opportunity for there to be a kind of political imagination to one's work, or reflecting one's cultural moment or one's sort of time on earth and where you happen to find yourself. These next two works were done were conceptualized right at the beginning of the Trump administration. So of course here we have a wall, and I lived on one side of the wall and my partner lived on the other side of the wall. This is called Your Turn. And on each side of the wall, there are 6 kind of, let's call them units or modules to help one live. So the blue rectangle is the bathroom, the red rectangle is the bed, the yellow is the kitchen, there's a red comfortable chair, a dining room, and a little desk that you can work at. So we lived here for 10 days, and we had to share everything. So there's enough for everybody, just not at the same time. So if I wanted to use the kitchen, Ward would have to push that kitchen to the other side of the wall. And so we lived like this back and forth. We had to sleep at different times, take turns using the bed. One guy would stay up into the night while the other guy was getting his chance to sleep. And it was, the communication between us was really quite difficult. We always knew the other guy was there, but it was almost like living exclusively through text messages. So it would be kind of like if he pushed the desk over too quickly, I would think, oh, why are you so upset with me, you know? or man, I haven't gotten to use that chair all day long. Why are you're just hogging that chair? What about my needs? These kind of very almost egotistical reflections on the way one relates. And then we would have to yell at each other if we wanted something, because we're both a little hard of hearing, and then there's this wall between us, even though we're right there. So it was a bit of an angry or frustrating piece to do. I'll see if we have. And there is, these. We've in talking to the people who come visit us, we've learned that we've noticed that there are some questions that happen again and again, and they're often quite jokey questions. They're a little infantile. They always want to know where the bathroom is. That's the first question, and they think, oh, well, these guys aren't really living in there. But then once we show them the bathroom, that question is more revealing in the sense that what they're really asking, we think, is can we trust you? Can we trust the fact that you're not leaving at night, that you're not going anywhere? Are you really here 24 hours a day? And so we try and live as normally as we can, but there we go. Sliding thing. It's doing something simple in a difficult way a lot of the time. So the full videos are on my website if anyone is really interested in a deep dive. But I want to move things fairly quickly tonight because there are other things to talk about. This work. We were thinking again about an antagonism. We were thinking about, Ward and I were thinking about, this was the first chance that we had gotten to build a work outside. And we thought, well, there's often this relationship that's formed through having to manage some sort of an adversary, some sort of difficulty. And so in this case, it was the wind. So this house is balanced on a single point, and then the wind blows and it spins quite gently, and then it also tips with the weight of people inside. So you can see Ward is on that end, I'm on the other end, and it's balanced. But then if we shift our weight, the whole house is just tipping. And we thought that this would be something that we would need to put sails on, or have some sort of means to propel the house and work together to do that, and maybe work to stop the house from spinning too quickly. But we didn't need to do any of that. It just kind of it worked less like a pinwheel, which just goes around and around and picks up speed, and more like a weather vane, which is that thing it usually has a chicken and an arrow. So it worked like that. It just found the point of least resistance, and it would stop there. And we found ourselves more being pushed apart by this house than in any way sort of joining together or working on some sort of common project. It was more about beauty in the end. Just sitting on the balconies became a very the most pleasant part of this work. And so ironically, this house that we designed to keep us together, to work together, actually pushed us to the far ends where we just balanced, and we spent very little time actually talking. People often ask us about our costumes that we wear. We started wearing these kind of red and orange jumpsuits in Flatland in that first project that I showed you, so that people could see where we are. It was also something to distinguish us from just everyday clothes, let people know that it was a performance and not a new kind of proposal for architecture of some sort. So again, in 2016, we were thinking about crossings and communities and walls and migrations, adversaries. You know, there are all these kinds of different relationships. I mean, that's really what we're thinking about when we're building these buildings. We're really trying to imagine, without necessarily trying to produce a certain kind of relationship, we set up with an idea. Oh, we think that this is going to be about a community making a crossing. This work is called The Newcomers. And this one was made for the Performa Biennial, which is curated by Rosalie Goldberg, who I showed at the top of the lecture. And it's basically going from point A to point B. This was done in Wall Street, near Wall Street, near Ducati Park, in Lower Manhattan, on a plaza of a bank building, the Chase Manhattan Bank Building. And we set up these kind of triangles, these pyramids with numbers on them. And in each pyramid, there's food, right? It was November, I'll just say, so things didn't go too spoiled inside of our refrigerators. And then on the first day, we built a house and we moved in. And then we woke up and we took it apart to get to the next bit of food, and then put it back together as a house with a different design. And we did this over the course of 10 days. There it is, sort of in between different, there it is as a bridge. It didn't actually have to go all that far. It was just maybe 20 feet, so maybe 7 meters between each of these flags. But it did take us all day to go from one place to the next. So a crossing, just a way of kind of going from one end of a plaza to the next. And we were there 24 hours a day, and people would come to talk to us and ask us what we were doing. And I'm sure we had very unsatisfying answers for them. But that's what we had, so that's what we gave. And this work, which is called Slow Teleport, builds from this idea that the building itself is the performance, that the performance is to build something. That's really the activity. And for this work, we were commissioned by a museum in Luxembourg to activate their hedge maze, the city's hedge maze, in some way. And it's a new hedge maze, it's not an old one. And I think ever since they built it, they've been trying to figure out how to make the public like it. Because, you know, you go there once and it's cool, but then to go back to the same hedge maze, I think, you know, maybe as a teenager this is great because you can drink beer in hidden places. But beyond that, it's hard to convince. So they opened up this public arts program and they asked us to make a proposition. So what we proposed is to build a structure, some sort of mysterious object at one end of this maze, and then take it apart bit by bit and use that to build a bridge to get to the other side of the maze, and then put it back together almost in the same way. I mean, some of the panels got turned around and flipped, and it wasn't quite the same object as it was when it started. But this, you know, when asked about what is this work about, you know, it's much less clear for us as it was to kind of like, oh, this is about a kind of cooperation or a kind of caretaking. But I think that there was an activity, just the act of building. And how do you form a community, and how do you know, what are the different roles that you take on? How does this kind of occur naturally, just through having to build, is something that opened up for us during this work. So each of these bits of the bridge was one of these panels that was part of the object, and we found a way of just tipping them down and moving the whole thing forward until we brought forward this idea of the food in these yellow kind of towers or little caches. It was also a way for people to see where were we going with this work as well. So that was a sort of survey of that first idea about performance in architecture. The idea that you build a thing that's extreme and see how that thing changes you. And thinking about this idea that Judith Butler has of habituating an activity, of doing this thing over and over again, and then having that shape you. If we make this kind of strange or extreme environment, it's more visceral. We're able to notice those changes a lot more vividly. The next group of projects I'm going to show was a very early idea about performance in architecture, and I hadn't quite landed on all the ideas that I've resolved now, or I've come to understand now, at least I think a little better. They basically my work with inflatables really started as a way to work at full scale, work at a very large scale, and have things move. You know, almost like the building is the performer. The building is moving. And this work called A Sack of Rooms All Day Long is basically a 50 square meter skin of a house with 4 inflatable rooms of a 80 square meter house. So something too big inside of something too small. And as the rooms start to inflate, they displace each other. Sometimes, you know, when something is fully opened up, here's what looks like a staircase. Oops, there we go. I have to go like that, there we go, and then it bubbles up. So it starts as this kind of puddle on the ground, and it emerges, you know, something that starts as something unrecognizable becomes cohesive in some way. It's writhing. It's very bodily. It's very. I'm interested in the way that these buildings kind of reference a mess or an imperfect human body rather than the one that we hope to have. I mentioned that the previous work, A Sack of Rooms, was kind of the first attempt at thinking about a building that moves, and the audience would stand around this work and look at it and think about it, but there was never a real engagement with it. There was no, and that was something I found I wanted to push. Like, that's how we get a little bit closer to something that I had been, you know, the architecture that I had practiced. So finding ways for people to kind of engage with it. So I gave them instructions, very, very simple instructions with this next work, which is called Snowballing Doorway. And it's basically, it's super simple, it's a doorway. And on top of that first inflatable arch is its exact copy, except turned upside down. So these two forms, they suck air from one another, they pass air back and forth all day long, and change the instruction of the space, either pass through or stay where you are, stay separated. So a kind of in-between movement rather than something that is of any sort of final form. I'm much more interested in understanding the way these change over time than I am in any sort of fixed state. Thinking about their transitions, thinking about when they are neither here nor there in this in-between space has been something I've been chasing. In this work is a kind of next curiosity about being able to visualize a body in a building, being able to visualize the way that you've occupied something through a photograph. So this inflatable has two forms, and they displace each other kind of like a pop-up book. And on the interior, there's this glow-in-the-dark fur. So the fur is much more appealing to sit on than rubber or the plastic. And when the lights go out, it takes a picture of you. It captures your impression. And then you watch that impression get kind of like swallowed up into the building, and then the lights come back on, you occupy it, and it just kind of keeps recording your image, sucking it into its materiality, collapsing in on it, a way for you to see yourself. The distance between you and a building is not necessarily so far apart. With this work, you'll see the fur returning. The fur is something that I've come to rely on in a way. It's a way. Whenever I want someone to touch something, whenever I want someone to kind of really dive into a space, I want them to take pleasure. I want them to just like almost not be able to not do it. It's, like you see that, it's like a dog, like you can't not pet it. So it's rather than hanging a sign on a work saying sit here, or making a literal chair, just giving some pleasure is what these fur bits are. This is a work that was installed in Tel Aviv. And it's basically 6 inflatable forms, 12 inflatable forms, 6 attached to the ceiling and 6 attached to the floor. And they push each other out of the way all day long at different rates. And the path through this space changes as they're sort of in transformation. When the gray forms are open, you'll be able to pass through this middle one from top to bottom, and then when the white ones on the ceiling are inflated, one can pass through horizontally. And there are different spaces that open up, different opportunities to lay down, to sit, to pass through, to pet, to bounce upon, all sort of coming and going, and I like to think of spaces as scores for what to do. They give us instructions. I'm sure I'm telling you guys things that you already know, but thinking about a chair as an instruction to sit down, or a door as an instruction to pass through, or a podium as a thing that lets you tell people what you think. These are all instructions, they're cues, we're familiar with them, they're language. And putting that language into motion rather than having it be something that's stable, animating that so that it's changing over time and giving different instructions for what to do, especially in these in-between moments where it's sort of neither here nor there, is a way that people need to start improvising in relation to a space. It's, that you're not 100% sure as to what to do. As I mentioned, there's an interest of mine in the relationships that something produces, rather than what it looks like as the way I evaluate it. This work is basically 2 sofas that are on a carpet, and then that carpet inflates and pushes those sofas together, so that the 2 people who are laying on these sofas are now suddenly face to face. So there's a going from being separate to intimate. This kind of intimacy with a stranger is pretty disarming. But to start that, you need fur, right? And no one's going to do that unless there's fur. So there's the fur. There's me with the fur. One of the things that I've been working with, and this is a kind of segue into some of my more recent experiments, is the fact that these inflatables all make sound. They're always noisy, and so how does one account for that? How does one sort of think about this noise that they're making? And I've started to think about them as instruments. This one was commissioned for a show in Detroit, which is half of the birth of techno music, as we know. Groups like Underground Resistance started there. So this is an inflatable that I imagine would go onto a dance floor and make that dance floor tighter so that it's fewer, people just kind of push together rather than separate in their dancing. And it's moving to the beat of Jeff Mills' The Bells, slowed down 10 times so that a track that was 5 minutes is now 50 minutes long. So this is what that's going to sound like. They move quite slowly. You know, they're moving more at the pace of a Buto dance than a ballet or anything sort of faster than a snail. This work from 2019 called Sense Factory is another tie back to the Bauhaus in some ways. It was commissioned by a space called Muffethalle in Munich. And it was commissioned by the Kulturstiftung des Bundes as a response to 100 years of Bauhaus. And the organizer wanted to take this score for a mechanical eccentric by Moholy-Nagy and make an interpretation of a space, a theater space, an experience space that took into account moving walls, changing colors, sound, scent, and haptics and sensor and touch, things that you would touch. So there were 5 artists commissioned, myself included, to work together to develop this rather large space. This kind of labyrinth of changing walls and surfaces and smells and sounds. But there was a kind of underlying frustration that I had with this piece, which is the way that we worked together. There was a frustration with the fact that the scent person was doing her scent thing, the sound person was doing his sound thing, I was doing my thing, and there wasn't a kind of investigation of what we could do together. And so I found this work in some way to have been a missed opportunity to turn this whole space into a big sonic instrument. That was the potential that I saw, to have the walls making the sounds rather than a soundtrack played as the walls were moving, rather than having those two things remain separate. And that kind of disappointment led to a kind of curiosity about how to make this work. So the next opportunity that I had to install a new work and conceptualize a new work was in 2020 for the Alarma Music Festival, which is happening every year. If any of you are in Berlin from the 10th to the 12th of August this year, please go to the Alarma Music Festival, alarmafestival.de. Great, fantastic experience. And I was partnered with a sound artist by Karina Martin, who is the curator and director of the festival. And Mieko works with field recordings. She's a Japanese sound artist, and she looked at the fans and used them as the field recording. So she put microphones on the fans of these three inflatables. They're maybe 7 meters tall, and they basically rise and fall. And so as I'm sort of controlling or composing the space, the sound is kind of being played back in real time. She collects the sound from the contact mic, processes it through a computer, and then plays it back through a large wall of speakers at the other end. So it's this real kind of, she thought, okay, these fans are so loud, I can never really do anything subtle, so I want to make it big. I'm going to just make them louder. I want to make these fans louder. So just to get a sense of how these move. So again, starting these inflatables as a kind of unrecognizable form, and then having them take a shape, and then go sort of falling back into something that you wouldn't be able to understand at first glance, is a process of making space that I've been drawn to by using inflatables. So it starts quite slowly. It's almost as though it's something waking up. Mieko also recorded the sound of the fabric unraveling and the fabric rubbing against itself, and played that sound back through a special speaker mounted to the top of one of these columns. And it's a directional speaker, so as it moves on the top of the column, you hear the sound in a line, and unless it's facing you, you can't hear this. So it's almost like you never are quite aware of where the source is. And this was exhibited at Berlin's first crematorium in the mausoleum space, which is 17 meters tall, I believe, with a dome ceiling. So when the sound shot out in a line, it would bounce off the ceiling and then back at the people, at the audience. And so it used the space itself as part of the instrument, as part of this thing that was shaping the sonic experience of the work. The two other columns had lights attached to them, almost with a desire of watching this work lick the walls of the space around it. So, thinking more about instruments and sonic instruments. I started making animations, and that's how Thomas and I first got to know each other. I reached out to him to recommend some assistance for animation, and these are, so I think of Thomas when when I see these words. In this work, I'm trying to think about the way that microphones and speakers they create feedback when they move too close to each other. And so there's a speaker, 4 speakers around this inflatable that's attached to a beam running through the space. And as the microphones get closer, it starts to make so that's how the sound is produced. And these ones, that one was, this one doesn't have sound, but I just love it, so we're going to watch this kind of happening. Again, there's the fur, right? One thing that started to become possible through digital representations, through the animations of these works, is I started to be able to anticipate what they're going to do once I make them. Which was not the case before. You would have your best guess as to what's going to happen. And so these really became a tool to start imagining how things will work and start often making things that, it just wouldn't be possible to do. But also then have a kind of, there are traces of them, these sketches or studies that find their way into a materialized work. And this is of a show that I had. These are sketches of that show, of one of the pieces, a kind of throbbing mass of milk in the center of the room. This is a show I had in Berlin at Galerie Barbertum in 2002, and it's called The Third Thing, and I kind of see these works as a band in a way. This one, there's a giant disco ball, a giant mirror ball, and at the center here is a speaker with the sound of another artist saying the name of this work, Her Joy, Her Joy, Her Joy, Her Joy. And then the speaker gets swallowed up and it becomes kind of muted, and then it becomes clear. And there's a way that the collapsing and engorging of this piece is modifying the voice in real time. As I mentioned, there was this there was a desire to have a beat for this band to have a sort of consistent sound for the live works to enter into as a composition. And so I worked with a sound artist named Frank Brett Schneider, who worked out a kind of track that was consistent, and then you could see it was set in relation to this animation that one can only see on a phone or an iPad, but you could always hear this beat, and it was milky. It was just a big field of milk in the whole room, almost that, and it was pulsing, and it would come towards you. We'll see a little bit of an animation of that, and then this is the final instrument in the band that I worked with a composer, Geneva Skeen, to develop, and it was developed as a kind of wind harp. So we strung strings over the opening of the fan, and then attached a contact mic so that it would have this, and then there were these twinkly bits of metal that were kind of introduced. And I hate to hear myself talk, but there's I'm Alex Schweder. These are some of the sounds of the piece. Gallery Barberthum, The Third Thing. So the term performance architecture is a term that I started using maybe about 15 years ago to describe my approach to architectural space as a way of asking questions rather than offering answers or trying to solve problems. And performance art as a practice, as a history, really has a kind of liveness that I think is already in architecture that allows a thinker or a person, someone who's in it or designing it, to make discoveries that inform what it is as they're in it. So I started working with inflatables because the way that architecture is usually built, and when I first started thinking about how performance can enter architecture, it was a way for me to kind of recognize my body in it as a time-based thing. Usually architecture is very stiff and rigid and permanent, and what inflatables allow me to do are make spaces that are time-based and change at a speed that my body recognizes. They allow me to make spaces that, even if it's an object in space, like the reflections around me, they're filling the entire room. They hit me, they hit the other people in the room, and in a way, makes a space that's always changing.
Her joy, her joy, her joy, her joy, her joy.
Inflatables, kind of like my body, have an aspect to them that I would rather is not there, and that's the fact that they make sound. They're impolite in that way. They always have this kind of whir and sort of shrill of a fan. And for this show, I have been thinking about these as instruments. So they all take the sound of the fan, they take the sound of the inflatable, and they turn it into a sonic instrument. And I've been working with sound artists like Geneva Skeen and Frank Brett Schneider in order to play this work live. And so in a sense, this is my band. So as I was putting together this rather eclectic band of inflatables, one aspect of them is that they don't have a way of having a beat. And I wanted there to be one work that had a kind of consistency that would allow the other live objects to enter into them. And so Frank Brett Schneider's work that I collaborated with him on, Our Milk, is an augmented part of the show that you always hear, but only see through a digital device. It's almost as though there's a third inflatable, and that's kind of where the title of the work comes from, something that is there but not there. So when Gallery Barberthum and I decided to do a new viewings show together, it was an opportunity for me to think about some ideas that were unmakeable. So I created two works for the show that became a kind of basis. It wasn't as though I was making them literally, but there's a spirit of each of those works that is in this show. So there's one last category of works, renovations, that I'm going to go through. I know I just looked at the time and we're needing to speed things up a little bit. But this is I'd say a shorter segment, and these are renovations. I had a show in Berlin in 2009, and I was really interested in seeing how far I could go with understanding architecture as a performance, as something that is immaterial, that the only thing that I change, or the only thing that I use to renovate a home is changing the way that it's used. That's it. Changing the way that it's performed, changing the actions. So I hung a sign in the window of Magnus Muller on Rosa Luxemburg Platz for free architectural advice. And I would then meet with people who would come into the gallery, and we would talk about their apartment. Based on that discussion, I would come up with a kind of different way of using their house. And I would write this up as almost like a little prescription for what they should do. Looking back at this work was the topic of my dissertation, and I really kind of picked this work apart. And I noticed something about how one performs an architect, how one performs a designer. I noticed that I was telling people what to do. Like, oh, you need to do this and this and this. And I'm the expert here, so I'm gonna tell you what to do. We talked about performance as a methodology at the very, very beginning, and this is what I've discovered. That when working with performance in architecture, I'm the last person that can tell anyone what they should do in order to solve a problem. Rather, these renovations have really become a way of discovering something. They're not out to solve a problem. In fact, whatever problem we sort of discover in the course of our discussions really becomes almost like a zone that we make detours around rather than solve. And it's the way that we make those detours, it's the paths around something that we can't do, that actually becomes the most interesting part of this. And asking whether this is architecture or art or performance, these categories in this work are, that I'm much more interested in what I didn't know and the ways that we're working around, the discoveries made along the way than I am about any sort of particular outcome. At any rate, this is one renovation called OK Boyfriend that I did with a friend of mine over the course of 4 years. Mandy O'Connell is a performance artist. And when she moved to Berlin, she moved into a very, very small bedroom. It's what she could afford. But she said, well, there's this loft in this bedroom, and I can sleep up there, and I could use the bottom floor for my studio. She gets in, and she discovers that, in fact, this loft was poorly built. She didn't trust it. She said, oh, man, this isn't going to work. This is just, where am I going to have my studio? I'll just be able to store stuff up there. I can't really use it. This is not what I expected. So that became the topic of her renovation, is figuring out this room. So she wanted to find ways of using the room differently. And I started asking her about, well, what kind of work are you looking to make right now? She said, well, I'm exploring femininity as an act of endurance, as that aspect of how I understand being a woman as needing to endure something. So we kind of conceptualized these positions that she would hold, kind of uncomfortable in the room. And we got there, and she said, and very soon enough we thought, well, this work has been done by artists like Gina Pane or Marina Abramovic. There's a whole history of works like this, so why are we doing this again? So then I asked her, hey, Mandy, what are you enduring architecturally about this room? And she immediately said, this loft. This loft is like a boyfriend that's just okay. Sometimes he's great, he'll pick you up from the airport, but then there are mornings where you roll over and you think, why are you still here? So, thinking about this loft as occupying this ambivalent place, we decided to make it a little worse. Like, okay, maybe you'll break up with your boyfriend if it gets worse. So we we began the renovation by making the room a little worse. And she lived with it for a couple of weeks and then said, yeah, you know, that kind of cute thing on the first date where someone is chewing their food with their mouth a little bit open. And you think, oh, that's kind of cute, but I know that in 3 weeks that's going to be really annoying. She said, well, that's happened. So I broke up with him. I changed everything that we did, but I found out what I really want. I want to have a boyfriend. I'm 33. I've never really had like a proper boyfriend, and it's scary to me. You know, there are all sorts of issues around it, but that's what I want. I think through this project, I can have a boyfriend as a performance. Like, I'll have a performance boyfriend, not a real boyfriend, because that's too scary. So then we used this loft as, I said, okay, so what would you do with your boyfriend? She said, well, I would make him laugh. He would be a little older than me. And so for this renovation of her having a boyfriend, I dressed up like her, I dressed up like the boyfriend, and then she instructed me as to how, you know, like what do you do? What are you doing in this space? And we kind of landed on this photograph as almost like a floor plan, but for a performance. It's an instruction to in some way enact, and with this idea that you build space through action as well as material. She never did find that boyfriend, but she did get married as a performance. She married her longtime mentor, Andrzej Wirth, who was a Polish theater director. And in this kind of, because she was able to see this marriage as a performance, they fell in love. It was never a kind of sexual marriage, or it was never consummated in that way. But there was love, and there was this ability to have his house on the weekdays, her house on the weekends, and so these different parts of herself that were this kind of freedom and this kind of consistency and stability achieved through her living in these two areas, these two different domestic spaces. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you all.